Nothing about us without us. How many times have you attended panel discussions on refugees without any refugees in the room? How often have you heard of policies, programs, and initiatives aimed at refugees discussed and decided without them? The answer is almost always. Generally, refugees are excluded from the process of shaping programs, policies, and initiatives that would most certainly shape their very own lives. 5 years ago, my family and I, alongside countless other Syrians, revolted against the long-lasting dictatorship. We faced killing, detention, torture, and eventually forced evacuation from our own homes and cities. July 2nd, 2013. My own father got detained by the Assad regime. My mom and my sisters had to flee and leave behind our home, our country, our family, our friends, and our father, and they became refugees. At that time, I was in the United States, so I sought political asylum. My mother has just been resettled to Canada after spending 5 years in Turkey. My older sister fled to Germany. My younger sister studies in Jordan. And my dad is still missing. One family, 5 countries. At the beginning, I wasn't sure how I felt about the label, the Syrian refugee. But I decided to embrace this new life and the label that came with it. I decided to speak up for refugees and displaced persons' rights. However, what I found was exclusion. At the beginning, I would go to events and listen to a panel by someone who is not a refugee, describing how hard it is to flee one's home and how refugees need our support. I felt out of place in the place that was supposed to be all about people like me. And then gladly, little by little, I would get invited to be the refugee in the room. The refugee whose story would help you understand the refugee experience, empathize with refugees, and support them. I embraced those opportunities. I still do. I believe storytelling, putting a human face to numbers, and building the human connection is one of the best ways to counter ignorance, xenophobia, and hatred. However, storytelling is not enough. One story is not enough. And we refugees each have our own stories. I'm mentioning panel discussions and conferences, but same happens in circles where decisions are made, where programs and policies and initiatives are designed with barely having any refugees in the room. Last year, alongside other refugees, we came together, and we co-founded what's called now the Network for Refugee Voices. It's a refugee-led platform that works on enhancing and advancing refugees' participation in policy-making. For the past 18 months, we've been working to make our voices heard. We have the voice. We don't need someone to give us the voice. We've been working to gain allies and partners to change and shape local, national, and international policies. This effort added to a long-term existing effort by other networks and groups and led to the historic move by UNHCR, the United Nations Agency for Refugees, finally to acknowledge the importance of refugee self-representation and participation. To that end, actually, UNHCR had granted the Network for Refugee Voices a seat on the table during the consultations on the Global Compact on Refugees. However, the seat was as observers. So this remains a symbolic engagement. Listening to refugees and consulting them is far removed from meaningful engagement. Furthermore, the refugee crisis is no longer a temporary one. The past, the present, and the research makes it clear that it is a long-term reality. The average stay in a refugee camp is 20 years. When one is born into this reality, When one spends that many years in a hut, this temporary state becomes a permanent reality. So it's time for refugees' self-representation. Refugees with the right expertise and background must be invited to be on the table and shaping programs and policies and initiatives, and be engaged on all different levels of the designing and programming of things that would shape their very own lives. Self-representation is a right. It's not a privilege. Today, I want you to take a second and think. Partnering with refugees, integrating them in the designing of programs and initiatives and programs, is the most win-win partnership that we could think ever of. It doesn't only make sense, but it's the right thing to do, to include me and people like me in shaping programs and policies on all different levels, so we don't only be the Syrian refugee, but we have a name and a say. We are here today to partner with you. If you agree with me today, you need to go to your institutions and lead a change that would make sure that nothing about refugees is without them, simply because nothing about us is without us. Thank you.